That was Danger Mouse and Danielle Lupi with Nora Jones singing Seasons Trees. Now, so far I've talked about the effects of the seasons on plants and on kind of animals in general, but I've not really talked about us. So it turns out that like other animals, we also experience fluctuations in hormones and behaviors and all sorts of things that happen differently during different seasons. And this is something that is important for us because it helps us, if you kind of go back to the distant past when we were not the sort of people that we are today, when we have nice calendars and schedules and lots of busy activities to do every day, this is something that helped us prepare for different times of year and the different sorts of activities that we would need to engage in. And in particular, this kind of fluctuation in hormones that are associated with different seasons and different activities, these are impacted by differences in light, and this is quite important for letting us know when we're supposed to breed and when we're not supposed to breed, and then kind of the eating and hiding and other sorts of activities that go along to make those things possible. Now, all of these changes now, even though we've kind of removed ourselves from that a little bit and we can kind of breed or not breed at any given time, these changes still can impact us, and one of the things that they can impact is our mood. So you may be familiar with something that's called seasonal affective disorder, or SAD. And that's something that happens where you've got people who've got symptoms of depression that regularly occur during a particular time of year. And that particularly is common at winter, though it can also happen at any of the other 3 seasons as well. And for SAD to be diagnosed, basically you have to show that each year you have this occurring, and it's something that doesn't occur at other times of year, but it's specific to a certain season, and it is repeatable from one year to the next. And doctors kind of argue over whether this is kind of a thing all of its own, or whether it's just a subset of depression, maybe something that in some people is just kind of a preliminary type of depression that leads into full-blown depression. But it is something that is clearly seen over and over again, and this was first documented in the 80s, or at least this particular disorder. The events surrounding it have been known for hundreds of years, but it's been called SAD since about the 1980s. So for 30 years now we've been studying these patterns. And what we see is that people have lots of things that kind of are similar to them, no matter where they're living or what season they are experiencing this in. And these things include sleep abnormalities, eating abnormalities, in particular wanting to eat a whole lot of food and kind of carbohydrate-rich foods. And this can cause weight gain, which has other issues as well as psychological ones. Also, there's quite often a feeling of low energy and inability to kind of get anything done. And this can be accompanied by social withdrawal and also feelings of hopelessness and pessimism, like you might commonly associate with just kind of any type of depression. And these things do occur in both men and women, but they're particularly common in the latter. And these variations in mood are probably linked to light. So you've got light interacting with lots of receivers in our bodies and then causing lots of different changes in our underlying physiology. And in particular, it seems like fluctuations in serotonin, which I've mentioned on the show before, it's something that can impact our behaviors and our moods. Also melatonin, and melatonin is something that is related to circadian rhythms, and circadian rhythms are what tell us to do certain things in the morning, certain things in the evening, so it kind of keeps us on that daily schedule. And again, if you've got light patterns changing and day length changing, you could quite easily see how melatonin might have a link to depression. Also, there might be some association between SAD and melanopsin mutations. And melanopsin is a photopigment in eyes. And so again, if you've got people who are looking out at the day or the night, and you've got a different level of activity of what's happening in terms of how much light is being received and how often that light is hitting the melanopsin and causing a reaction, you can see where this change in day length might be associated with some sort of change in how the body perceives the environment, and then how the hormones and other molecular patterns can be changed. And being from kind of a more northerly latitude, you guys are probably familiar with the idea that SAD is more common in areas where the shifts in day length are more intense. So this has been particularly well documented in Finland, and also places like Alaska and very, very far north in Canada. But actually, even in the UK, there have been some studies that have found that people in our region also suffer from this, because we also have particularly short day length in winter, so this can be quite an extreme thing, and very long days in the summer. And actually I saw one study when I was kind of poking around and reading about this that specifically mentioned people in Ireland, and I'm not sure whether that was Northern Ireland or the Republic of Ireland, but Irish people have been studied in this context quite well. And the rates of SAD can actually go up to about 10% kind of in I guess I would say kind of regular type latitudes, and they can go even higher than that in the more northerly latitudes. And this can actually be mitigated in a number of ways. So one of the most common of these is treatment with bright light. So basically people just sit in front of light for about 30 or 60 minutes, somewhere in that range. And they're supposed to keep their eyes open because they do need the light to actually hit the photoreceptors in their eyes. But then they can just kind of read a book or watch TV or whatever, and they just sit in front of these very powerful lamps that have specific wavelengths and specific amount of power associated with them, and that can alleviate the problem because it does seem to give them what it is that they were missing. Also, exposure to ionized air seems to be kind of a useful treatment. And this is quite a weird thing, and I actually couldn't figure out why this was a useful treatment. But basically they pump in air that has negatively charged particles, and that causes some sort of benefit to people who are experiencing SAD. It doesn't seem to be quite as useful as the light treatment, but it is something that does work. And finally, some people who are in really extreme circumstance can be supplemented with melatonin, and this seems to kind of balance out whatever issues they've been having where they haven't had quite enough light exposure, or it hasn't been working in quite the same way, so they just put melatonin in the body. And another thing that's kind of often associated with SAD but also can stand out on its own is suicide rates. And people frequently do link suicide rates with winter, and particularly with Christmas, which is kind of a different issue. But actually researchers have found that there is not a consistent relationship. The link between suicide in winter and suicide in the holidays is actually something that's kind of an urban myth. And if you look at the data, suicide rates are more closely related to the day of the week than to the time of the year. However, mortality in general can be quite closely related to the season. And that seems to be something that's driven by temperature fluctuations, and that's for two reasons. So first of all, and this is not all the more common of these things, people will die of hypothermia when the temperatures are cold enough. But secondly, at this time of year you tend to have lowered resistance to illness, and also greater exposure to illness at the same time, because it's cold outside, so we all kind of go inside and we're cooped up together and we share germs much more easily. And we have lowered resistance to illness at this time because our bodies are working quite hard to deal with the change of season, to make sure that we're warm enough and to do kind of other regular upkeep activities. And so here we are being exposed to illness at exactly the worst time, because that's when we're least able to cope with it. And so we do have lots of deaths at this time, but not from suicide so much as from just regular death associated with disease. And some people have proposed that all of this kind of fluctuation in our behavior and our mood during winter and summer, the cool months and the warm months, may be an adaptive response. So obviously not the immunity thing so much as the mood stuff. But this may be something that helps us use less energy during times of scarcity. And that part of it actually may be tied into the whole immune system suppression. Because basically, if you can kind of shut the body down a little bit, so we're not quite hibernating, but we are kind of reducing what we're doing as much as possible, then maybe that can help you get through a time when food is scarce. So if you aren't feeling motivated to go out and be all peppy and run around a whole lot, it's kind of a bummer that you're not feeling great about yourself and that you're not very happy, but at least you're not wasting energy at a time when you might not be able to supplement it. So this might have some sort of an evolutionary reason. And it may be particularly common in women because there's this relationship with reproduction. This is all kind of conjecture, no one really knows this for sure, but it does seem kind of logical that if we traditionally were breeding in the springtime like many other animals, that it would be good for us to kind of lay low during the winter and put on stores in order to be in the best shape possible to carry young in the springtime and give birth and meet all those energetic demands. Now, in general, there are lots of kind of behavioral patterns that vary with season, just kind of across the animal kingdom. And it's quite interesting to just think about what happens, generally speaking, in each of the 4 seasons, and how does this kind of impact our interactions with wildlife. And again, like before, I'll just kind of start the cycle with spring, because that seems like a very logical place to start. So during the spring, you often have animals waking up from hibernation. So these are things like reptiles and mammals and amphibians. There are all sorts of things that hibernate. And they're very sluggish during this time. Often they're kind of groggy and they'll just kind of sit and not do much because it takes them a while to get their systems functioning again. And they may be quite approachable during this time, and it can be quite weird if you're out and suddenly there's just a little animal that's sitting right there and it doesn't look like it's doing much. And that's often in the springtime because it is kind of revving up its system. And you see this, especially, I've noticed it anyway, with frogs and toads, and they just kind of hop around like they're drunk, or they kind of stumble their way somewhere and they look completely uncoordinated. And unfortunately, because of this, they can make themselves really easy targets for traffic. So springtime is a time when you tend to see lots of animals that have become victims to speeding cars or people biking or all sorts of things that wouldn't be nearly as dangerous at other times of year. But these guys just don't have the energy, they don't have the wherewithal to avoid traffic at this time. And you often see quite a lot of gorging going on because these guys that have awakened are trying to restock their energy reserves. They're trying to supplement what's been taken away by the winter hibernation and lack of food, but they're also trying to get ready for the breeding season, so there's just a whole lot of eating. And during this time, animals quite frequently will visit human areas to supplement their food from your garden, or to go through your trash can, or to find your leavings, whatever the case may be. So there do tend to be lots of encounters at this time. And because this is the breeding season for many animals, you will see lots of activity associated with nesting, attracting or keeping a mate, competing with rivals, raising young, all those sorts of behaviors that tend to make animals most conspicuous to us. So this is particularly common when you've got animals that are out searching for a mate or searching for food for their young. So they will often move around quite a bit more. So you not only hear them as you would normally, and you'll also see them quite a bit more, not just little sightings, but maybe kind of long. You'll get to watch them actually actively move around in the habitat. This is also a time when we tend to have little guys moving into our home because they're trying to find a place to breed. So things like squirrels and birds and small rodents, this is when you might see a lot of them because they'll show up and try to find a nice place to nest. And they tend to do this especially often up in the attic or down in the basement, or a nice tucked away place where we won't see them quite as often. And another thing that's important for us to know about is actually, we tend to think of springtime as a nice, pleasant time when the birds are singing, and there are lots of interesting and nice displays to watch at that time, but also animals can become quite aggressive during this period, and that's because the males are very hormonal. They're trying to get a female and fight off competitive males, and they're trying to keep animals out of their territory, and they also might be raising young already, and so they want to scare you away from their young. So they also can be animals that you want to stay away from at this time of year, as nice as it is to watch them. During the summer, you'll often have animals that were born in the spring starting to disperse across the habitat. So this is another time when you'll kind of have gone through a lull at the end of spring, but then in the beginning of summer and the middle of summer it will start to ramp up again, where you see lots of animal movement. And many of the species will take advantage of crops that we've been planting. And these are crops that are in gardens, but also kind of commercial crops that we might want to sell. And so unfortunately, summertime is a time when you've got a lot of tension between humans and wildlife. But actually, they're doing us a favor in many cases because there's a large amount of feeding and dispersal activity associated with the plants. And so when these animals are eating our plants, they're taking the seeds and putting them elsewhere. And so that's why you've got things like bramble that might start spreading all over the place. And suddenly you've got lots of blackberries, or maybe you didn't have blackberries before. So this is actually quite a nice time, kind of ecologically speaking, because you have all these changes being made to the ecosystem, or certain patterns that are being upheld by these behaviors that happen every year. And the plants also are interacting with the weather at this time in order to disperse their seeds on their own, not just in association with animals. And so you have different plants that are reacting to the moisture and the wind and producing seeds that are dispersed, maybe because they blow away through the wind, or they get trapped in a rain droplet and then fall onto the ground. Whatever the case may be, you do seem to have lots of activity with kind of reproduction of both plants and animals at this time. And the animals that bred in the spring, many of them might undergo second or third or even fourth breeding attempts in the summer. So many animals will continue breeding through the entire warm period of the year. And once they're done with that, you often see molting happening. So for geese, for example, you'll have the geese dropping all of their flight feathers at once, and so they're going to go off somewhere that's nice and safe where they can sit in the middle of a pond and not have to worry about the fact that they suddenly can't fly because they're molting their feathers. But you'll also see other animals starting to kind of change their plumage because they're getting ready for the colder months. And usually they do this after the breeding season because breeding is quite energetically costly, but once that's done, they can kind of turn their energy to other purposes like molting. Now in the autumn, you've got animals that are starting to think about the fact that winter is coming and the temperatures are getting cooler. So you've got the hibernators looking for places in which to den, and this includes often our homes. And they're also looking for good food stores because they want to eat anything they can find in order to put on those fat reserves. And animals that gestate over the winter, so things like bears that will have become pregnant and will gestate their young and then give birth over the winter or just the following spring, they may engage in reproductive activities at this point depending on how long of a gestation period they need, and they're certainly going to be putting on quite a lot more fat than kind of non-gestators because they need to be able to take care of both themselves and their young. Now during the autumn, if you're a bird watcher in particular, you know that migratory species are going to be really visible. And this is for several reasons. First of all, like all the other animals, they're putting on fat. In this case, they're putting on fat because they want to fuel their migration. Secondly, they're actually undergoing migrations. You'll see huge flocks of animals flying past. And thirdly, you'll also see them stopping over in between locations along their migration routes, and that's because they need to fuel up. And so they have these stopover sites where they'll all come down and they'll eat lots of food and kind of rest up and then take off again. And some species at this time in particular may swap plumage and fur not just because they're molting in order to get their nice new set for the next year, but specifically because they want to have more appropriate winter coloration. And also because you might need to put on a different type of outer layer in order to have enough heat retention during the cold weather. So things like Arctic foxes and also the ptarmigans, they'll change color from kind of brownish or reddish into a nice white coat or nice white plumage that will help them blend in with the new weather conditions that are coming. And just to end off the year, we've got winter, and as I mentioned earlier, this is the time when you've got food scarcities, and so many animals will begin to range really widely in order to find whatever food is available. And that's why we've got things like snowy owls that suddenly appear down here in Falmouth out of the blue, or all these Arctic birds that might show up. And you also have other types of species as well, not just birds, that will kind of roam far and wide in order to find what they need at any given time of year. And if you are a bird watcher, you'll notice that many species of birds will form mixed flocks when they're foraging during this time. And that's because they're no longer territorial. So tits that might have been up in their trees defending their territories will suddenly kind of make friends with each other, and you'll see a whole bunch of different tits flying around together and being quite happy with each other. And I actually noticed this just the other day when I was out birding. I saw at least 3 different species of tits just foraging all together in one big flock. And you often will have opportunities to have migrants that will settle in for the winter in places where they're not normally found during the rest of the year, and they'll stay there until the spring, so the entire winter. This is a great opportunity for people to go out and actually see unusual species because they know where they are going to be found, and they know what they're doing, and you can kind of go and watch these great animals. And this is something that a lot of people will do, like for instance at the Isles of Scilly, when you've got these kind of unusual species that might show up and then hang tight till the warmer months. That was the birds singing "Turn, turn, turn, to everything there is a season," an oldie but a goodie. Now to end up today, I just kind of want to tie it all together by thinking about what might happen as we have changes in the seasons and seasonality because of climate change. So as you might have noticed from all the things I've been talking about throughout the show, things happen at very specific times, and all these different events become tied to each other because of that. So the blooming of plants, the movement of migratory animals, the production of young, all of these are dependent on each other to be successful because organisms kind of work together in an ecosystem, and there's this kind of flow of nutrients and energy, which I mentioned in a previous show. And if you disrupt that, then animals might not have the resources that they need, and plants might not, any organism, they won't have what they need in order to be successful and continue the population. So changing the timing of any of these events can alter the success of others. So if we've got a change in day length that's telling birds to migrate, then they're going to migrate. But if they have not yet had access to enough food resources, then they might not have enough fat to fuel the trip. Or if they arrive and plants aren't blooming and insects aren't out, then they might not have the resources that they need once they get there. And you also might have a case where light is altering hormones, and hormones lead to breeding, and animals need to have the resources available to care for their young so they can then raise the next generation. But if that food's not available, then the young might starve, and even the adults might starve as well. And of course we don't want either of those things happening. And so what's happening here, what's happening is that you've got the Earth doing the same rotation that it always does, the seasons happening in an astronomical way in the same way that they always have, but the weather patterns that are associated with those starting to fluctuate because of these alterations in the climate. Because as I said, it's all about how the sun's rays come through the atmosphere. And so if we change that pattern, then we're going to have different amounts of heat and energy being distributed in a different way, and that's going to change the timing of when we have these weather patterns. So what sorts of things do we already know that have happened? Well, obviously I could talk about polar bears and glaciers and whatnot because everyone has kind of heard that at this point. But there is actually some other information that's quite interesting. So, for example, someone has done a long-term study in the U.S. Rockies, and he's found that snow is melting earlier, and that's a result of warmer seasons and less snowfall and also dust from storms that speeds up melting. And as a result of this, you have hummingbirds arriving later to correspond with later blooming flowers. You also have hibernating marmots that are awakening earlier, and actually these guys can benefit because they seem to be putting on more fat during the summer. But that's not true of all species. So for example, those hummingbirds I mentioned, they're coming earlier but not quite early enough, so they still haven't compensated enough and they aren't able to get access to the amount of food that they need. And you all have probably heard of Thoreau, and in Concord, Massachusetts, Thoreau started records of phenology, which is kind of the timing of things. And people have continued those records over the last several decades, and they found that species that haven't moved up their first bloom dates to correspond with these changes in temperature with season, they're actually starting to disappear. And so you have these fundamental species that are necessary to an ecosystem beginning to kind of fade out because they aren't able to respond to this disconnect between the kind of day length and the astronomical patterns and the meteorological patterns that we now see. And these can also affect people in a negative way, and so we kind of seem to think of ourselves as a bit different. But actually we also are quite tied into these patterns. And a great example of this is in Alaska, where you've got the native people who have always hunted moose, and they rely on moose. But they have this legal hunting season to make sure that the moose won't be hunted at a time that's quite dangerous to them, that will hurt their population. But now the moose are changing their activities because of the changing weather, and that means that there are fewer moose during the hunting season, and so these natives aren't able to get what they need for the winter. So they either have to go without this traditional food source that they've had for hundreds and thousands of years, and that's a really important part of their culture, or they have to poach, and neither one of these things is a very good option. And these sorts of legal issues are they just kind of, they're part of the problem. They show what part of the problem is, but there are lots of other things as well. So you can have people that suffer from differences in ecosystem structure and health and function, and all the services that are provided by an ecosystem that might be altered by changes in weather. And this just highlights, I think, how important the seasons are and how they play an integral role in our biology and our culture and kind of everything that's happening on the planet. So hopefully you won't take away the negative note of climate change so much as the positive note of how interesting seasons are and how they affect us in lots of different ways. And I will end off today with another song about our particular season right now, autumn, and this is Mia Doi Todd.